Perfect. Great job. Check it out. Come on, let's go take a look. What is that?
Happy Valentine's Day, Mom. You guys good?
Claudette had lots of friends. She was very active in school. She was very generous. She was loved animals. Absolutely loved animals.
She was about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed about 90 pounds. Brunette, an attractive young lady. High school graduate, attending college.
We're doing all right. Happy Valentine's Day to you too, honey. Are you still coming?
Of course I'm still coming. I can't wait to see you. I have some big news.
Claudette, I don't want to interrupt your studies.
Don't be ridiculous. I'm coming. And tell Dad I have a special...
It was, I think, about a 3-hour trip, so that would have put her there at 4:35, somewhere, depending on traffic.
When she didn't arrive, you just figure, well, maybe she got a flat tire or something. And we waited and waited, and then there was nothing.
I'm not gonna sit around waiting like this. You stay by the phone. I'm gonna start heading back up I-20 to look for her.
I'm going with you. I'll call the Ramseys, and they can sit by the phone in case she calls.
Okay, I'll bring the car out front.
When she didn't come home that night, Craig and I got in the car and we rode down to I-20 because it was the first time she would have been coming out to the farm. So I thought maybe she got lost or the car broke down. And Craig and I went in and out all the exits. And we went down about halfway and she wasn't there.
Claudette was a very independent person and had her vehicle broken down on the side of the road. I'm quite certain that she would have known how to change a tire.
When the morning arrives, with still no sign of their daughter, the Physicks call the campus police in Marietta, who notify Cobb County Police. The missing persons case falls to Detective Mike Christopher.
Got info on that car.
You ran the plates?
Yep. 1988 Chevy S10 pickup. South Carolina plates. I ran an APB, but no hits.
Carolina plates. Well, we should loop in the GBI as well. She could have crossed the state line by now.
You got it.
That same morning, Agent Fred Mays of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation goes to visit the Physicks house.
Claudette's a responsible girl. She's got a sensible head on her shoulders. I just can't figure out where she's gotten to.
I wish my daughter's room was this neat. Oh man, that girl's just got posters of boys all over the walls. Kinda makes me nervous, you know? It's like, why do you need all of these posters?
Not much out of place, huh? No sign of a struggle, at least.
Right. Is that a diary?
No. Valentine's Day card, name, number, John Gertz.
Hi, hello. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry. Hi, I'm Angela.
Angela, hi. Detective Mike Christopher, thanks for coming.
Oh, God, is Claudette all right? I swear I'm gonna kill her.
I'm sure she's fine, but she didn't show up at her parents' yesterday, and they're just worried about her, that's all.
And Jason isn't with her?
Who's Jason?
That's Jason Ragland, her boyfriend, right? Was he supposed to be with her?
What a jerk. Yeah, he was supposed to go with her to meet her parents. She's been all excited about it. She's really crazy about him.
How are they as a couple?
Disgusting? No, I mean that in a good way.
Graduated with honors from University of Georgia.
Go Dogs.
Claudette was working for a local pet store to supplement her income while she attended college.
So would you say that you guys are serious?
Sure. We've been together a while now. I was supposed to go with her up to her parents' house. I feel horrible about that now.
About that, could you walk us through what happened that day?
Well, me and Claudette spent Valentine's Day together.
Tuesday night.
She stayed over at my place. The plan was she left early for class on Wednesday, and she was going to stop by when she got out around noon and pick me up. And then we were going to drive up to South Carolina to meet her folks.
Hey, you. Big day. You gonna be ready?
I don't know, Claudette. I feel terrible. I just woke up with something, and the headache's gotten worse.
Wait, what are you saying? Are you bailing on me?
I know you're mad,
Jason.
but babe, you don't want me meeting your parents like this. Trust me.
I don't believe you.
She didn't buy that you were sick.
Look, I was terrified. Her parents are these super conservative types. Catholic. I'm just not ready for that. I tried to tell her I didn't want to go, but it's like she just wasn't listening to me. I just think it's better I stay home.
Fine! Guess I'm going by myself!
So did you stay home that night?
I went back to bed. I think I got up around 2 o'clock, showered, and then came in here. Figured I might as well clock in for a 3 to 10 shift.
You can do that?
I'm the fish department manager. It has its perks.
So when was the last time that you talked to Claudette?
I didn't. I figured she just went up on her own.
What about John Gertz? That name mean anything to you?
Fat guy. Yeah, he's a friend of Claudette's, a classmate. He's all right.
What about Michael Braddock?
What about him?
He works here.
You can check the back. He's here.
Listen, Jason, we appreciate your cooperation. Would you be willing to come down to the station to take a polygraph?
I guess if it helps y'all find Claudette.
Michael Braddock? I'm Agent Fred Mays with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
Is this about Claudette?
Yeah, it is. You mind telling me how you know her?
She works here.
So that's it?
I know she's missing. I don't know anything about that.
You mind telling me where you were last Wednesday?
You know, I actually took last Wednesday off. I was home.
And who else was with you?
Just me.
You know, I heard that you and Claudette might have been an item a while back.
When you find her, ask her. I thought we were.
What do you mean?
Claudette, can we talk?
What?
So you're busy this weekend?
What are you talking
You
about?
made plans with Jason? Really?
Look, we never said we were exclusive. Listen, Michael. You're a fun guy to hang out with. But Jason and I, well, it's complicated. It's getting more serious.
It doesn't seem that complicated to me. I got work to do. And that was that.
Michael Braddock did not want to break up with Claudette, but I believe she told him that she had feelings for Jason and she was going to date Jason Ragland.
So no hard feelings? You guys, it's all work.
She made her choice. Can I get back to work now?
Look, we don't know what's happened to her, but she's got a lot of people very worried. So would you mind taking a polygraph for us down at the station?
I'll think about it.
Back on campus, Detective Christopher tracks down the name he found in Claudette's room and the young man it belongs to, 23-year-old sophomore John Gertz.
So at that point there, anyone associated with Claudette was a suspect in her disappearance.
So you saw her that morning?
Yeah.
She was in a real hurry after class, or maybe just excited.
You remember what she was wearing?
Claudette, hey, wait up. Blue jeans, white sweater, I think, with red stripes.
Any jewelry, anything else distinctive?
Oh, her class ring. She always wears her Sequoia High School class ring.
What can you tell me about this? It was on Claudette's desk.
Yeah, I gave that to her.
So we can rule you out.
Look, I gotta get back to class.
He could have had a motive. You know, if she rejected his advances or whatever, you know, he could have done something to her.
It doesn't take long for the story of the missing co-ed to make the evening news.
It's one of the biggest things there in Marietta is the college, Southern Tech. When this happened, there was a lot of, you know, news coverage and news media that covered this story because she was a co-ed there at the college.
Did you do any harm to Claudette?
No.
Do you know where Claudette is right now?
No.
Seems calm enough. How'd the motel turn out?
Nothing. Not unless Claudette suddenly turned 45 and adopted 3 kids.
John in Hiram, Georgia, searching for Claudette. It's a muddy mess of thick undergrowth and flooded streams.
It's very rough terrain. Paulding County is very rural, and there was a lot of wood area, swamp, you know, that we had to search.
It's grueling work, based on an imprecise map. And after 2 days of exhaustive searching, they turn up nothing. But a few days later, another anonymous map has them back out in the same swampy wilds.
Another one.
Yeah, with a note. You haven't found Claudette's body because you haven't adequately searched the indicated area. Can you believe this?
We get another map from the same person that stated that the other map was messed up and that this is where her body is actually at.
He's messing with us. P.S. Please do not involve the news media before a successful search.
Anything back from the lab on the first one?
No, it was completely clean. You must have used a sponge to seal it. Handwriting analysis shows male, organized, persistent.
Gang parked 2 cars here. A path taken by gang. I mean, these are real streets. You gotta get back out there.
Another one.
Yeah, with a note. You haven't found Claudette's body because you haven't adequately searched the indicated area. Why don't you take up that way?
This time, the map points them a few miles due west of the original location.
We gridded off the area. We searched foot by foot, and we did have cadaver dogs with us. The sheriff in Paulding County brought out a lot of his deputies to assist us. We had some all-terrain vehicles, and for a couple of days we searched, and with negative results.
What do we have now?
You're gonna love this one. Came with a nice little drawing and everything.
After the third map, you know, we kind of figured it was a hoax.
Do you think it's just one of our college boys trying to throw us off?
Let me get this back to the lab. I got an idea about who's doing this.
Oh, wait. That's not actually why I called you over. Evans, do you have those polygraph results? Check this out. Just came in today.
Jason and John?
You're not gonna believe it.
What the hell?
Boyfriend's clean. Passed on all the questions.
According to the polygrapher's report, Jason Ragland, the boyfriend of missing co-ed Claudette Physick, was truthful in all his responses. He knows nothing about her disappearance.
Yeah, we started looking at other people more so after he passed the polygraph.
Check out the other one, John Gertz.
Did you do any harm to Claudette? And he failed.
It's like John Gertz. We know more than what he's telling us. John, have a sec?
Hi, Detective. What's new?
We're gonna need to have a little talk, John.
Is this about the polygraph?
I keep getting calls from a guy named Lewis Martin. Says he's a friend of Claudette's. Wants to know how the investigation's going.
Oh.
He's your friend, isn't he? You put him up to it?
I guess he was scared that, if he called, then the police gonna be looking at him more, because I think we interviewed him about 3 or 4 times in this investigation.
Look, I don't know what you're trying to...
You failed one of the polygraph questions, John.
Failed? Look, I know I was the last one to see her and everything. I know how it looks. But I really like Claudette, and I have no idea what happened to her.
We're gonna talk to more of your friends, John. You better hope they all have nice things to say.
Over at GBI headquarters, Agent Mays has gotten a break on the strange maps they received.
We did identify a person we think that was sending the maps. He had done a similar incident like this before.
Oh, what a pain in the ass.
The area that he said her body was at was very close in proximity to his residence. And he's probably watching us as we were searching for her body. And that's why he sent the 3 maps out. And we didn't have enough evidence to charge him. He was just a thrill seeker that was throwing the police off, and it really, we wasted 3 or 4 days, running down that lead, which turned out to be nothing.
It solves one mystery, but the mystery of what happened to Claudette remains unsolved.
All right, pat on the other side. Honey, you're doing great.
Until...
Check it out. Come on, let's go take a look.
2 canoeists are enjoying a paddle down the flooded Oconee River near Ben Burton Park in Athens, Georgia.
What is that? Oh my God.
We had a lot of flooding. There was a lot of rain. That's probably why, the body, floated to the top of the river.
Within the hour, Athens Clark County Police have arrived at the scene. The body's been in the water a while, but clearly it's a female.
Careful there.
And on one finger is a class ring. 1992 Sequoia High School.
And I got a page. So I went over and, I knew then it was Claudette's body, just by the physical description, the ring, and all of that.
Now, who the hell is this?
Detective Christopher, Cobb County.
Speak up, son. I can't hear you because of the damn frogs.
Detective Christopher, Cobb County. This is Agent Mays. We think you might have our missing girl here.
Glad you guys could make it. Based on your description, it's her.
What's that wrapped around her?
That's some kind of polyurethane rope. She was wrapped real tight and weighed down, it seems.
Is that a boat anchor?
Yep. That other thing, I don't know what that is.
Looks homemade.
The piece of steel was a very unique piece of steel that was tied to her legs.
Any way to tell how she died?
Body's in bad condition. But my best guess is she was already dead. Dumped up river. By the park. You can get in the current a lot easier up there.
We'll take the pots.
Pardon me, gents.
I'd like to have her body sent back to the GBI lab for autopsy. Maybe they'll find something.
Investigators spend days combing the Oconee River and its muddy banks for clues. But it looks like she was killed 6 weeks ago, so any evidence of who did this and how has been swallowed up by the current.
Mike actually called Craig, and all I heard was Craig questioned it. How can you be sure it's her? And then I just broke down. It was over with. And with that, Craig said, I gotta go. And he hung up the phone.
Claudette's mother and I, we talked almost daily during this investigation. We're agents, cops, whatever, we have a job to do, but we also have family members and stuff. And I know that I would not want someone calling me and telling me that over the telephone, that my sister is dead or my daughter is dead.
When I was first told that they had found Claudette's body, my gut and my heart had dropped to the ground. It's not something that you want to hear. It's not something you want to be told, especially from your mom. You just get a sick feeling.
It devastated them because that was their baby. That was their daughter, and they loved her a lot. They was very close to her.
You found who did this?
No, not yet. But there's more.
What? What happened to my girl?
It's not that. There's no easy way to tell you this. But the medical examiner found that Claudette was pregnant. Nearly 4 months alone. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, copy that. No, Jason's not here. And I'm gonna need you to track down Michael Braddock for me. Seems he no longer works at the store.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm coming in. There's something I want to check out first.
Detective Mike Christopher went and talked with a foreman at this construction site, which was directly across the street from the pet store.
Excuse me, sir. I was wondering if you might help me out.
Absolutely, what you got?
Do you happen to recognize this girl?
Pretty, but no, I don't know her.
Well, she used to work across the way at the pet store.
Sorry, man, maybe you can check with the other guys. You okay, buddy?
Hey, Fred. Yeah, I'm over by the pet store.
You really should grab yourself a hard hat if you're gonna be walking around.
I need you to do me a favor, right now. Do you still have that piece of steel we found at the river?
What's all this?
We have a piece of evidence here. Looks a lot like some of those over there.
Here we go.
Where'd you find this?
In a river, tied to a dead body.
Whoa. That's ours, all right. See that there?
Uh-huh.
The foreman there identified the piece of steel as coming from that work site. It had a unique number on it.
Question. Do you recognize this guy? Also used to work over the pet store.
No, I don't know him.
What about him?
Oh yeah, that's Jason, the fish guy. Likes to park over on this side. Sometimes he borrows bricks, stuff, for the store. He's a nice guy. 'Cause 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 'cause
That night, Agent Mays and Detective Christopher execute a search warrant on Jason's apartment over in Marietta.
So guess where Jason used to live when he was a bulldog? In Athens. Right next to the Oconee River.
Take a look at this. Carpet's been replaced.
Check that out.
As we were examining Jason's apartment, we noticed that there was a piece of carpet that was cut out of his closet. A square piece of carpet.
Same size.
There's a process called luminol. And basically, it's a chemical you spray and it'll show the presence of blood. So we had to do it at night, so it can be, completely dark.
All right, hit the lights.
It showed presence of blood. It lit up.
It's not just from a shaving cut.
And I think we know whose blood it is.
After the luminol, the presence of blood, the district attorney in Clark County stated that we had enough probable cause to arrest Jason.
On Monday, April 11th, less than 2 months after Claudette's disappearance, Georgia Bureau of Investigation agents arrest Jason Ragland at the house of one of his relatives. He's charged and won't, with no way out.
Hello? Hey, you. Big day. You gonna be ready?
Let's talk about it, babe. I'll see you in a few.
There was no argument until Claudette showed up at his apartment.
This is unbelievable. How could you bail on me like this?
You want me to drive all the way up to your parents' house to tell them I'm not going to marry you?
You worthless piece of trash!
Careful what you say.
What are you gonna do about it? Jason. What are you doing? No!
And I think they argued about him going to South Carolina with her. And I believe things got out of hand, and I believe he killed her. And whatever he killed her with, it could have been strangulation or whatever, but there was blood, somewhere there that was, in the area of the crime scene. And I believe it was in the carpet, and that's why he cut the carpet up and out of the closet.
That afternoon, he went into work as usual. He knew that to get rid of her body, he had to wait until the cover of dark. After returning home, he loaded Claudette's wrapped body into his own truck, as well as a boat anchor and a welded piece of steel he'd found at the construction site. Then he headed east toward Athens.
And he tied that boat anchor in that piece of steel truck, and he wrapped her body in that carpet. He was familiar with Athens, Georgia, and he took her to the Oconee River and put her body in the Oconee River. I think he looked at his pregnancy as going to be a burden to him, so I don't think he felt bad about doing the crime.
Once back home, he drove Claudette's pickup truck south toward Atlanta and abandoned it off an exit ramp in a sketchy part of town. From there, it wouldn't have been hard to catch a cab home.
I knew he probably knew what type of place that was. It's probably why he left the keys in the ignition, knowing that somebody probably will, steal it.
It's not clear how Jason passed his polygraph exam.
What I've been told by a lot of polygraph examiners that if you don't have a conscience, if you don't feel bad about doing something, then, you most likely can pass a polygraph.
As for Claudette's friend, John Gertz,
I think he cared about Claudette. He had some emotions going on there, and it evidently interfered with the responses when he took the polygraph.
For the double homicide, Jason is sentenced to life in prison.
he killed her on Ash Wednesday, and they found her on Palm Sunday. He's got more to answer to than what's on this earth.
Southern Tech University planted a tree in Claudette's honor, and there was a ceremony that the family came down for that. We attended that.
It was the kind of place that should have been protected by its own ordinariness. A frozen yogurt shop on a December night in Austin, Texas, lit by soft commercial brightness, humming with the small rituals of teenage work, was not supposed to become a grave. It was not supposed to be the setting for the last hours of 4 girls who had plans beyond that evening, girls whose names would one day be spoken in courtrooms, in newspaper retrospectives, in documentaries, and in the lowered voices of parents who remembered exactly where they were when they heard, on the night of December 6th, 1991, inside an I can't believe it's yogurt shop in North Austin. Something happened that would tear a hole through the city and leave it there, more than 3 decades later. The wound still has not closed. Austin would carry forward with its music, its growth, its new skyline, its reinventions, but beneath all of that, under the concrete and the bright appetite of modern life, the old question would keep breathing. What happened to those girls, and how? With so much attention, so many investigators, so many theories, so many years, did the truth still manage to stay just out of reach? There are crimes that seem to conclude the moment the sirens stop. And there are crimes that go on living, changing shape, infecting memory, feeding on uncertainty. The yogurt shop murders belong to the second kind. They did not end at the fire. They did not end when the bodies were found. They did not end with arrests, or with confessions, or with prosecutions, or even with those prosecutions falling apart. They became something larger and colder than a single night of violence. They became a ghost story with real names attached to it, a case that made people look differently at strip malls, at closing shifts, at daughters leaving for part-time jobs with ponytails and backpacks in the assumption that they would be home before midnight. And at the center of that ghost story were 4 girls, very young, full of the untidy promise of adolescence, drawn together by friendship, by family, by routine, by the simple fact that on a Friday night in early December, they were in the same place at the same fatal time. Eliza Thomas was 17. Amy Ayers was 13. Jennifer Harbison was 17. Sarah Harbison was 15. They were not symbols then. They were not part of a case file then. They were girls with private jokes, with the ordinary anxieties and excitements that belong to youth, with parents who knew the shapes of their footsteps in the hall. The city would later freeze them in the public mind as victims, but before that, they were alive in all the small specific ways that matter more than headlines ever can hold. A shift at a yogurt shop, a visit from friends or family, a Friday night that should have ended with tiredness, maybe a late snack at home, maybe homework waiting on a desk, maybe the lazy relief of the weekend stretching ahead. That is what makes certain cases unbearable. The violence is terrible, but so is the banality of what it interrupts. No one steps into a yogurt shop expecting to vanish into history. In Austin, December has a particular feel. Even when the day has been mild, evening can settle in with a thin, needling cold that creeps under jackets and carries the smell of asphalt, exhaust, and winter dry air. The city in 1991 was not the Austin it would later become in glossy brochures and relocation pitches. It was smaller, more locally legible, still carrying traces of a place where people could believe they understood its edges. Yet even then, like every American city, it had its shadows. Parking lots after dark, businesses closing up under neon, teenagers working late, men drifting in and out of public spaces without anyone really seeing them. Evil rarely announces itself with thunder. More often it moves quietly, dressed in the clothing of the forgettable. That night, somewhere between the fluorescent certainty inside that shop and the darkness waiting outside the glass, a line was crossed. The details, over the years, would be sifted and argued over with exhausting intensity. Witness statements, timelines, the positions of doors, the sequence of actions, the possibility of one perpetrator or more than one. Who was there? Who was not? What could be trusted? What had been contaminated? But before all of that complication, before the lawyers and detectives and reporters and documentaries and books, there was the raw fact of the crime itself. 4 girls were bound by terror inside a place designed for sweetness and routine. 4 girls died there. The building was set on fire. As if flame could erase not only evidence but humanity, as if heat and smoke could consume the crime so thoroughly that it would leave behind nothing but ruin and confusion. Yet fire is a blunt instrument. It destroys. But it also reveals the desperation of whoever wields it. Arson at the end of the crime scene often feels like panic given shape. It suggests not confidence, but fear. Fear of what might be found. Fear of what had been done. Fear that the room itself, with its surfaces and stains in broken order, would speak too clearly by the time firefighters arrived and the doors were forced and the interior yielded its horror. The city had already begun to change. There is always a before. Even if the people living inside it do not know they're standing on the edge of one, before the call, before the emergency lights, before the first officer saw enough to understand that this would not be a burglary. Not an accident, not anything that could be folded back into normal life. Then comes the after, and the after is merciless. Parents are awakened, names are confirmed. Rooms at home become unbearable museums of interrupted youth, hairbrushes on dressers, school papers, shoes by the door, coats still carrying the smell of outside air. The after is where a family learns that time can continue moving while their own world has stopped. The after is where a city discovers that outrage does not guarantee answers. The after is where grief begins to harden into obsession. That is what happened in Austin. The crime did not merely shock people, it lodged in them. It was too cruel, too intimate, too senseless, and too public. A yogurt shop is not a remote roadside. It is not some abandoned structure at the edge of nowhere. It is a storefront in a community, a place of errands and sugar and teenage employment. A place people passed without a second thought. To imagine such violence, there required a rearrangement of civic faith. Parents began to look at closing shifts differently. Business owners imagined their own storefronts at night with the lights off and the registers counted and a pair of young employees left to lock up. Teenagers, who are supposed to live inside the illusion of invulnerability for at least a little while, were forced to look at their own world through adult fear, and still. Even at the beginning, amid the shock and funerals and the first surge of police determination, the case carried the seed of the thing that would later define it: instability. Not just the instability of rumor, though there would be plenty of that, but the instability of the evidence itself, the narrative itself, the sense that the truth had been scorched, smeared, interrupted. This is what makes unsolved crimes so corrosive. In a solved murder, grief at least has somewhere to point. There is a name, a face, a verdict, a finality. Even if it is imperfect, in an unsolved one, grief remains restless. It keeps reopening drawers, rereading testimony, listening for footsteps that never come. It circles back. It bargains with memory. It becomes vulnerable to false hope, to bad leads, to the awful temptation of certainty where certainty does not exist. In the yogurt shop case, that corrosive uncertainty would become almost as notorious as the murders themselves. Men would be accused. Confessions would emerge, then crumble under scrutiny and contradiction. Prosecutions would move forward, then fracture. Families would endure the special agony of being told, more than once, that the answer had been found, only to watch it dissolve again. And in that repetition lies a second kind of violence, quieter than the first, but lasting much longer. The violence of almost knowing, almost justice, almost resolution, almost peace. The truth, in this case, did not simply hide, it appeared, or seemed to appear, in broken reflections. It let itself be mistaken for something else. It teased the investigators and tormented the families. There is something especially haunting about crimes committed against the young because youth carries such a visible future. You do not only mourn what was, you mourn what had been expected. The birthdays that should have arrived, the graduation photographs, the first apartments, the college struggles, the awkward adult years, the marriages or divorces or career changes or quiet, ordinary Tuesday mornings that would have filled the decades. Violent death at that age feels like theft in its most expansive form. It steals the body. Yes, but also every unrealized version of the self. For the families of these 4 girls, that theft was compounded by public attention. Their loss was private in the ways that mattered most, but it was also immediately absorbed into public language. Coverage, speculation, community fear, advocacy, reinvestigation, court dates, appeals, anniversaries. There is no clean way to live with grief under a spotlight. It turns mourning into a duty performed while strangers watch. Yet the public attention also came from something understandable and human. People could not let this case go because it violated too many assumptions at once. 4 victims, not one. A business, not an isolated field. Teen girls, not adults seasoned by the world. Murder, sexual violence. Fire, then the years of legal chaos that followed. It became one of those cases people bring up to measure the limits of the system itself. If this many people cared, if this many resources were thrown at the question, if arrests were made and confessions obtained, how could the answer still be in doubt? The case unsettles because it suggests that the machinery designed to transform atrocity into certainty can fail not just quietly, but spectacularly. Evidence can be mishandled. Memories can bend. Interrogations can produce words that sound like truth and still not be truth. Prosecutors can believe they have reached the end of the maze when they are only deeper inside it, and while institutions struggle. Time does what it always does. It erodes. Witnesses age. Details blur. Physical evidence degrades or becomes contested. Investigators retire. Journalists move on. Neighborhoods change names. Storefronts become other storefronts. The city grows over the site of its own nightmare. But families do not experience time the same way institutions do. For them, the year of the crime can remain electrically present. A date on the calendar can still arrive with the emotional force of impact. A photograph can still detonate a room. A case file can still feel warm from the hand. That is part of the emotional architecture of this story. It is not only a story about one night in 1991. It is a story about what that night became in the lives of those left behind. It is about how uncertainty hardens into a second climate around grief. It is about what happens when a city cannot decide whether it remembers a crime because it wants justice or because it cannot bear the lesson the crime delivered, because perhaps that is the ugliest lesson in all of this. Sometimes a place can be permanently altered not by what it knows, but by what it cannot prove. In Austin, the yogurt shop murders became an open chamber in the public imagination. A place where rumor, evidence, memory, and longing all echoed together. Some people believed the right men had once been caught. Others believed the real killers were never properly touched by the law. Some lost faith in the confessions. Others lost faith in everything. What remained constant was the dead, and the fact that no argument, no legal development, no retrospective examination could bring the 4 girls back into the warmth of their interrupted lives. That has to be where the story begins. Not with the courtroom, not with the disputed statements, not with theories polished by hindsight, but with the terrible contrast between what the place was and what it became, a yogurt shop on an ordinary winter night. girls at work, family and friendship moving in and out of the space. Then a closing hour that did not close. Then violence. Then fire. Then a city staring at ashes and trying to understand how the familiar had become monstrous. Every notorious case acquires a mythology, but mythology can be dangerous. It can turn victims into emblems and facts into folklore. So before we descend into the investigation, before we trace the false starts and broken certainties, before we stand in the courtrooms where justice seemed near and then slipped again through human hands, we have to stay here for a moment, in the terrible threshold where ordinary life ended. We have to remember that this story is not famous because it is mysterious. It is famous because 4 girls were murdered, because their families were sentenced to decades of not knowing, and because a city learned that even under bright fluorescent lights, evil can enter quietly, do its work, and leave behind a silence so deep that 30 years later people are still leaning toward it, listening, hoping that at last it will say something clear. Austin in 1991 still carried the feeling of a place people thought they understood. It was growing, yes, pushing outward and upward in ways that hinted at the city it would someday become, but it had not yet fully transformed into the symbol it would later represent in the American imagination. It was not yet shorthand for a booming tech haven, not yet a polished brand packaged in slogans and skyline photographs. It was a capital city with a college pulse, a music heartbeat, a streak of independence, and neighborhoods where routine still felt legible. Parents drove the same roads every day and believed, as parents often do, that familiarity itself was a kind of shield. Shops closed at predictable hours. Teenagers worked part-time jobs after school. Friday nights settled over parking lots and storefronts with the same gentle logic it always had. There was danger in Austin, of course, because there is danger everywhere people live, but much of it felt distant, compartmentalized, kept to the edges of adult life. For many families, the everyday center still seemed intact. The place where the yogurt shop murders occurred sat inside that everyday center. The I Can't Believe It's yogurt store on Anderson Lane was not the sort of location people attached to private dread. It belonged to the ordinary commercial geography of suburban life, to that American landscape of illuminated signs, glass-front businesses, and broad parking lots where errands and small pleasures are conducted beneath fluorescent light. Frozen yogurt shops in that era carried a particular innocence. They were bright, sugary, adolescent places. Halfway between childlike indulgence and teenage independence, they were where parents took kids after school, where young couples stopped for a low-stakes date, where employees behind the counter were often girls still in school, learning customer service, counting cash, wiping tables, and stretching out the first fragile thread of adulthood. Nothing about such a place suggested menace. It suggested routine, cleanliness, sweetness. Maybe a little boredom near closing time. Maybe the low hum of machinery and the faint tart smell of dairy and sugar in the air. That was part of the horror later. The violence did not invade a dark alley or a deserted rural road. It entered a place built for harmless appetites and teenage labor. To understand the emotional force of what happened there, it helps to understand the world those girls inhabited before the crime transformed them into public names. The early 1990s were a threshold period in American life. Close enough to feel familiar now, distant enough to have belonged to a different emotional climate. Teenagers moved through their days without cell phones in their pockets, without location sharing, without the constant, invisible tether that now links children and parents minute by minute. A part-time shift after school or on a Friday evening involved a little more silence, a little more trust, a little more empty space between departure and return. Parents expected that space. They lived inside it. A daughter could leave home in the afternoon, work a shift, maybe stop somewhere briefly, and be expected back later. And the absence between those moments was not immediately alarming, because it was woven into the structure of the time. There were landlines, message pads, clocks glanced at in kitchens, the sound of a garage door or a key in the front lock announcing that the person had come back into the house. Modern habits of instant reassurance did not exist yet. That does not mean families worried less. It means worry had different contours. It rose more slowly, often from intuition rather than broken digital contact. It was built on delay, not interruption. In that world, teenage work was treated as something wholesome and formative. It meant responsibility, spending money, confidence, and a first taste of the broader world. A yogurt shop was almost the ideal version of that. It was public, local, brightly lit, and socially acceptable in the full, reassuring way adults like to imagine. The girls at the center of this case moved inside that structure of trust. They were young, but not so young that their presence in a shop after dark seemed shocking. They were old enough to be counted on, old enough to close a store, old enough to feel that particular teenage mix of fatigue and pride that comes with doing grown-up tasks while still carrying school books and curfews in the background. Eliza Thomas, 17 years old, worked at the yogurt shop. Jennifer Harbison, also 17, was there that night as well, and her younger sister Sarah, 15, was with her. Amy Ayers was 13. These ages matter because they describe the threshold each of them occupied. None of them were fully settled into adulthood, yet all had crossed enough of childhood to be trusted with movement, with work, with independence, with plans that did not always require an adult to stand beside them. That threshold can be beautiful. It is where personality begins to sharpen, where friendships feel huge and defining, where the future starts to glimmer not as an abstraction but as something with actual shape. It is also the threshold that can make violence feel especially obscene. To kill someone at that age is to strike them not only in the present, but at the very point where possibility is beginning to unfold. Austin itself, in those years, lived on a threshold too. The old city and the future city overlapped. There were families rooted in neighborhoods that felt stable and knowable. Yet there was also growth, movement, and the low static of social change. A city on the rise can carry a strange contradiction. It sells itself internally as open, creative, youthful, alive. But that same openness creates blind spots. The commercial corridors expand. More people pass through. The rhythm of public space becomes busier, less intimate, and paradoxically easier for strangers to disappear inside. A city need not be enormous to produce anonymity. It only needs enough emotion that one person's ordinary presence does not register deeply in the minds of others. Parking lots fill and empty. Customers come and go. Teenagers behind a counter recognize faces, perhaps, but not names. Men enter stores, linger, leave, and are remembered only vaguely, if at all. This is the kind of environment in which evil can operate in plain sight before anyone understands what they have seen. Anderson Lane was part of that suburban commercial geography. A place where people crossed paths without necessarily knowing one another. It was familiar ground to locals. But familiarity can be deceptive. We often imagine the places we know as inherently safer because we can picture them clearly. We know where the roads bend, where the signs glow, where businesses sit in relation to one another. But map knowledge is not the same as protection. A storefront can remain exposed no matter how often people drive past it. A brightly lit business can still become isolated after dark when neighboring activity thins out and closing time leaves only a few employees inside. The girls in the yogurt shop were surrounded not by wilderness, but by the ordinary emptiness that arrives after hours in commercial spaces. That emptiness has its own kind of silence, not total silence. Never that. There are always distant engines. HVAC systems humming, a radio from another shop. Maybe a late car rolling through the lot, but it is a silence of social thinning. Of fewer witnesses, of the world pulling back just enough for harm to gain room. In reconstructing the context of this crime, one has to resist the temptation to imagine doom hanging over that Friday evening like a visible storm. For the people inside their own lives, it was just another winter night. That is what is so unbearable about retrospect. We lay tragedy backward across harmless details until everything starts to look ominous. A shift at work becomes the beginning of the end. A family visit becomes the last normal interaction. A parking lot becomes a stage waiting for violence to enter. But nothing feels like that while it is happening. Life in real time is usually too ordinary to announce catastrophe. The girls would have moved through their evening with the habits of routine. Cleaning, serving, talking, waiting for closing. Perhaps glancing at the clock, perhaps thinking ahead to the weekend. The adults in their orbit would have been doing the same in their own spaces, making dinner, driving, expecting the night to move along its usual tracks. The brutality of the crime is inseparable from that lost ordinariness. It shattered not only lives but assumptions. In the aftermath, Austin parents were not just grieving for 4 girls they may not have known personally. They were grieving the collapse of a shared story about what kinds of places were safe enough, what kinds of jobs were harmless enough, what kinds of evenings ended predictably enough. This is one reason the case seized the city so fiercely. It was not simply that the crime was horrifying, though it was that the setting made the horror contagious. People could imagine their own daughters there. They could imagine their own sons dating or knowing those girls. They could imagine their own family stopping at that shopping center. Their own routines brushing past the same glass windows and fluorescent light. A notorious crime becomes civic memory when enough people feel that it could have entered their own life by only the slightest turn of chance. The victims themselves were not interchangeable figures. Each belonged to a household, a rhythm, a web of affection and recognition. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison were sisters, which adds another unbearable layer to the story. There is something especially devastating about the destruction of siblings together, as though a family line of memory is struck twice in the same blow. Sisters share private language, rivalry, protection, humor. Habits so subtle outsiders hardly notice them. They move through a home in relation to each other. One leaves a glass somewhere, the other rolls her eyes and moves it. One borrows something without asking. One knows by the other's footsteps what kind of mood is coming down the hall. That kind of ordinary intimacy, the texture of a family's internal life, is almost impossible to represent once tragedy steps in. Public narratives flatten it. But it matters because murder does not erase only a person. It erases the moving dynamic they create with others. Amy Ayers, 13, stood at the youngest edge of adolescence, a period so charged with becoming that adults often forget how fragile it is. 13 is old enough to feel nearly grown in some moments and very small in others. It is an age of sudden intensity, fierce friendship, embarrassing uncertainty, and a life still strongly braided with home. Eliza Thomas, at 17, was close enough to adulthood to be looking beyond high school with that mixture of impatience and vulnerability that marks late adolescence. 17-year-olds often occupy 2 worlds at once. They are trusted with more, expected to be more capable, yet still dependent on the shelter of family and the promises of a world they have not yet tested. To understand the context of the yogurt shop murders is to hold all of that in mind. These were not abstract victims in a famous case. They were girls inside the ordinary progression of youth. The city that held them was a city still convinced, at least in part, that ordinary life could be counted on. And then there's the season. December matters. Not because it romanticizes the story, but because the emotional landscape of early December is different from the rest of the year. There is a tension in that month, especially for families with children or teenagers. School breaks loom ahead. Holiday music appears in shops. Homes begin to fill with plans, errands, gifts not yet wrapped, lists on refrigerators. The low-grade chaos of winter schedules, the nights feel darker. Not only because they arrive sooner, but because they gather around that sense of domestic expectation. People are supposed to be heading home, not vanishing into violence. A teenager working an evening shift in December belongs in the family imagination. To a temporary delay before re-entry into warmth, there is supposed to be a return. Coat off, shoes by the door. Some half-finished conversation resumed. When that return does not come, December can harden forever in memory. Every anniversary carries weather with it. The cold air, the darkness, the decorations beginning to appear in public spaces, all of it becomes fused to dread. For the families in this case, the season itself would never again be innocent. The social climate of 1991 also shaped how the crime would be received and investigated. This was a period when public faith in law enforcement still carried a certain weight. Even as that faith had already begun to crack in some communities, a shocking crime of this scale drew confidence that the state would mobilize. Collect facts, identify the guilty, and impose order on chaos. The community looked toward investigators not just for technical competence, but for moral restoration. They wanted the city stitched back together through arrests, through certainty, through official narrative, but the very intensity of that demand can become dangerous. High-profile cases generate pressure, and pressure distorts. It speeds judgment. It elevates promising fragments into dominant theories. It can make contradictory evidence feel like an obstacle rather than a warning. The context of the yogurt shop case includes not only the world before the murders, but the emotional conditions into which the investigation was born. Fear, outrage, political expectation, media scrutiny, civic hunger for resolution. All of that would matter later when the case moved from crime scene to interrogation room to courtroom and then into the long, bleak territory of doubt. But even before any suspect was named, before any confession was extracted or challenged, the essential context was already set. A city had lost 4 girls in a place it had categorized as harmless. Parents had learned that familiarity could fail. A commercial strip of North Austin had been transformed from routine geography into haunted ground. The frozen yogurt shop was no longer simply a store. It had become the center of an absence, the site around which grief and speculation would gather for decades. When people later spoke of the case, they were not only speaking of what happened inside that building, they were speaking of what happened to Austin's sense of itself, because some crimes do more than kill. They expose the thinness of the stories communities tell about safety, progress, youth, and control. They reveal how much of everyday life rests on untested faith, the faith that daughters come home from work, the faith that bright storefronts are safer than dark roads, the faith that a city knows its own face. On that December night in 1991, those faiths were not merely shaken. They were burned open, and in the years that followed, as the case twisted through accusation, hope, collapse, and uncertainty, the context of that original rupture never disappeared. It remained beneath everything. A cold pressure under every development. 4 girls. A yogurt shop. A Friday night. A city that thought it understood itself, and the moment it discovered that under fluorescent light, amid sugar and routine, there had always been room enough for terror to walk in and close the door. What can the dead say when they were denied the chance to finish even a single sentence? In cases like this, the phrase victim statement carries an almost unbearable weight because there was no courtroom moment in which these girls stood upright beneath fluorescent lights and told the world what had been done to them. There was no trembling voice reading from a page, no pause to gather breath, no chance to force the guilty to listen. What remains instead is something more fragile and, in its own way, more haunting. Their statement survives in pieces. It survives in who they were before the violence came. It survives in the ordinary shape of their days, in the people who loved them, in the errands and routines and plans that now read like broken lines from a life interrupted mid-thought. It survives in the cruel contrast between the softness of their youth and the brutality that met them. And so, to listen for the victims in this story, we do not listen for courtroom language. We listen for the quieter testimony that life leaves behind. We listened to bedrooms that were not emptied willingly. We listened to schoolwork that was meant to be finished. We listened to the tone of a family dinner waiting to become complete again and never doing so. We listened to a winter night that began as if nothing in the world were wrong. The statement of the victims begins there, in the fact that they belong to life more than to death, to a future more than to a case file, before the city learned their names as a collective tragedy. They were girls embedded in the intimate architecture of family and adolescence. They were not defined by the end. The end came later, violently and without permission. Before that, there were moods, habits, relationships, little vanities, irritations, ordinary hopes. There were mornings when getting dressed felt more urgent than history. There were afternoons shaped by school and by the endless emotional weather of being young. There was laughter that disappeared as soon as it was made, because laughter at that age is often careless and immediate, thrown off into the air without the slightest thought that someone might one day ache to hear it again. That, perhaps, is the first and deepest statement these girls leave behind. They were alive in the full, messy, unfinished way that young people are alive, and the crime was not simply an act of killing, but an act of silencing that living complexity. Eliza Thomas was 17, an age balanced on the lip of departure. 17 is close enough to adulthood to feel its pull every day, yet still young enough to live under the patterns of home, school, work, and the expectations of people who still see a child in your face even when you do not. At 17, the future does not arrive as a stable picture. It arrives in flashes. A job, a car ride, a conversation about what comes after high school, the small pride of being trusted with responsibility, the private fear of not knowing what shape your life will take. A girl of that age can seem composed one moment and utterly young the next. She can be dependable at work and uncertain in the mirror. She can speak with confidence about one part of her life while quietly carrying tenderness and insecurity in another. To imagine Eliza only as one of 4 victims is to flatten her into history's final category. To imagine her as she truly was requires returning her to the rhythm of her own becoming. The same is true of Jennifer Harbison, also 17, whose life was bound not only to the larger world of friends, school, and late adolescence, but to the intimate orbit of her sister. Siblings create a form of witness that the outside world rarely sees clearly. A sister knows what version of you belongs to the family and what version you present elsewhere. She knows your temper in the morning, your habits when you are tired, the little competitions and loyalties that outsiders would never think to name. Jennifer's presence in this story cannot be separated from Sarah. 15. Because the fact of their sisterhood is itself a statement about the life that was destroyed. Murder does not only remove individuals, it breaks relationships that had their own texture, their own history, their own future. Somewhere in the ordinary unfolding of their family life, Jennifer and Sarah had already lived through the tiny dramas and intimacies of growing up together. They had shared space, time, maybe clothing, maybe secrets, maybe irritation, maybe protective instinct. Maybe the kind of teasing that makes no sense unless you belong to the same house and the same bloodline. To lose one daughter is devastation. To lose 2 at once is something language struggles even to approach. It is not only grief multiplied. It is the collapse of an entire internal family geography. Amy Ayers, at 13, stood in a different place on the path of youth. And that matters too. 13 is an age still illuminated by childhood at the edges. However mature a 13-year-old may seem in a given moment, there remains something provisional and tender in that stage of life. Something still close to innocence, even when adolescence has begun its confusing work. 13 carries its own emotional contradictions. It is an age of longing to be older and of not yet understanding how young one still is. It is an age of bright enthusiasm, fierce embarrassment, quick emotional weather, and a selfhood just beginning to solidify under the pressure of peers, family, and imagination. To think of Amy is to feel the special cruelty of a future cut off at its earliest meaningful threshold. The life ahead of her was not merely unwritten, it had barely begun to decide what kind of script it wanted to be. This, too, belongs to the victim's statement. Their ages are not just facts in a report. They are evidence of what was stolen. When a case becomes notorious, details tend to harden into their most public forms. Names become linked forever in the same sentence. Ages become parenthetical. The setting becomes iconic in the worst possible way. Yet if we are to hear the victims at all, we have to move against that hardening. We have to let them become distinct again, even if the exact contours of their personalities are now partly obscured by time, by media simplification, by the bluntness of public memory. The dead are often forced to speak through what others can bear to remember, and memory is uneven. One person recalls a smile, another remembers reliability. Another remembers a tone of voice over dinner, a shopping trip, a look exchanged in a hallway. These are small things. But small things are often the truest records of a human life. No one is made real by biography alone. Realness gathers in gesture, in habit, in the repetition of being known, and the victim's statement then is not a literal testimony. It is a cumulative human record. It says these girls had places in the world that were specific and warm and ordinary. It says they were expected home. It says their absence was not abstract but immediate. Felt first in living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms before it was ever grasped by the public. It says the crime was not only an assault on bodies but on trust. In the mundane beauty of everyday return, there is a particular cruelty in the way sudden violence transforms the last ordinary hours of a person's life into material for permanent inspection. The final work shift, the clothes worn that evening, the errands completed or delayed, the people seen, the small decisions made without significance at the time. After a murder, everything is dragged into the light and forced to carry meaning, but the victims themselves did not live those hours as evidence. They lived them as life, a Friday night in December, a place of work, family nearby, the loose social rhythm of a weekend evening. Those details, now freighted with dread, were once simply part of the flow of time. That is why any victim-centered account must resist turning the girls into ghosts before the crime even begins. They were not moving toward tragedy with dramatic music around them. They were moving through a normal night. The statement they leave is therefore painfully simple. We were here. We were living. We were doing what girls our age were supposed to be allowed to do. We were participating in the ordinary world that adults told us was manageable, safe enough, structured enough. And then something entered that world and annihilated it. If their lives had been allowed to continue, the language surrounding them would have changed quickly. They would have become women with biographies too complicated to summarize in a few tragic paragraphs. The teenager at the counter might have become a teacher or a nurse, or someone who hated her first office job and quit, or someone who moved away and returned, or someone whose life became so ordinary that strangers would never think to ask about it. One sister might have become the careful one. Or perhaps both would have surprised everyone. The youngest might have grown out of all the awkwardness of early adolescence into a person entirely different from the girl her family knew at 13. This imagined future is not sentimental decoration. It is part of the victim's statement because violent death erases not only what someone was, but the range of what they could have become. In unsolved cases especially, the dead can become trapped at the age of their murder in the public imagination, endlessly frozen beneath the label of victim. That label is necessary in one sense, but it is also a theft. It steals movement from lives already stolen by force. One of the most devastating aspects of the yogurt shop murders is that the victims were not granted even the crude final dignity that a solved case can sometimes provide. There was no settled truth strong enough to hold around them. Instead, their names were carried for years through disputed confessions, court reversals, failed prosecutions, fragments of theory, and the exhausting churn of uncertainty. Think of what that means for a family. The dead are gone. And then even the narrative of what happened to them refuses to stay still. Every new lead opens hope and then withdraws it. Every arrest offers the possibility of a finished sentence and then collapses into another unfinished clause. The victim's statement, under such conditions, becomes burdened by the noise around it. It has to fight to remain human amid legal argument. It has to survive media framing, police error, prosecutorial confidence, defense doubt, public speculation. It has to keep saying, beneath all of that, these were girls, not symbols. Their suffering was real even when the official story around it was unstable. Their deaths were final even when the case never was. In many criminal cases, a victim impact statement comes after conviction. After guilt has been named and confirmed by the system, it serves to describe the moral and emotional cost of what the defendant has done. Here, in the absence of a final uncontested resolution, the statement has to emerge another way. It emerges through loss itself. Through the family members who woke into a reality they had not been built to survive, through empty seats, through birthdays that changed flavor forever, through the impossible practicalities that follow catastrophic grief. Clothing that remains in drawers, school materials that no longer have an owner, calls that never need to be made, holiday plans that become unbearable. The statement lives in the rearrangement of an entire domestic world around absence. A home after violent loss becomes a place of altered gravity. People still move through it, but differently. They lower their voices or erupt without warning. They avoid certain rooms until avoidance itself becomes another kind of pain. They cling to objects because objects have not yet learned how to die. A jacket still carries shape. A hairbrush still holds strands. A note in a familiar hand still seems, for one instant, to belong to the living world. For the families in this case, the girl's statement would have arrived not as a composed narrative, but as 1,000 collisions with what remained. What they said from beyond death was embedded in everything they did not get to finish. There is another dimension to this statement, and it is the moral accusation their deaths make against the failures that followed. The girls could not speak, but the case itself kept speaking on their behalf. It spoke in the inadequacy of easy answers. It spoke in the danger of forcing certainty where uncertainty remained. It spoke in the agony of false resolution. It said, over and over, that the dead deserve more than procedural momentum. They deserve truth sturdy enough to hold. They deserve an investigation disciplined enough to withstand pressure. They deserve a justice system that does not confuse confession with clarity or prosecution with understanding. In this sense, the victim's statement extends beyond who they were as individuals into what their case demanded from the living. It demanded seriousness, humility, precision, patience. It demanded that no one treat their murders as an opportunity for institutional self-congratulation, and when the system stumbled, as it did, that stumbling became part of the testimony too. Not because it explained the crime, but because it revealed how vulnerable the dead are to the ambitions, errors, and limitations of the living. Still, before the machinery of investigation begins to dominate the story, it is important to return one last time to the girls themselves, or at least to the kind of human atmosphere they must have inhabited. Youth has a sound to it. It is not one sound, but a cluster of them. Fast footsteps, sudden laughter, the scrape of a chair, a half-finished sentence because the thought changed direction midway through, the language of plans that are made casually because the future seems guaranteed. I will do that tomorrow, maybe this weekend, after school, later. Next month, such phrases are the native speech of adolescence. They presume continuation, they lean forward. Violent crime destroys more than flesh. It destroys grammar. It turns future tense into forensic record. It severs language from the life that was meant to keep speaking it if we listen carefully. That may be the deepest victim's statement in this case, not a speech. But a silence where speech should have continued, not a declaration. But an interruption so total that the city has been trying for decades to hear beyond it. 4 girls went into a night that should have led them onward. Instead, their lives ended in terror. And the world left behind had to piece together their meaning from memory, grief, and the stubborn refusal to let them be reduced to the single fact of their deaths. Their statement is in that refusal. It is in every act of remembering them as daughters, sisters, friends, workers, adolescents, human beings before they were evidence. It is in the insistence that the sweetness of the place where they died does not define the brutality of what happened, and the brutality of what happened does not fully define the lives they had. It is in the ache of all that remained unsaid, and perhaps that is the most faithful way to hear them now. Not as characters speaking from beyond the grave, not as convenient symbols of innocence, but as girls whose very incompleteness is part of the tragedy, girls whose lives were still in draft form, whose statement to the world was still being written in the ordinary language of growing up, until one December night in Austin someone put a violent end mark where no ending should have been at all. By the time the night closed over Austin on December 6, 1991, the city had already begun to settle into its ordinary winter rhythm. Cars moved through the commercial strips with headlights washed pale against the dark. Stores dimmed one by one. Somewhere people were finishing dinners. Somewhere teenagers were making weekend plans. Somewhere televisions glowed in living rooms while parents absently checked the time and assumed their children were exactly where they were supposed to be. Nothing in the air would have announced that one of the city's most infamous crimes was about to unfold inside a frozen yogurt shop, in a place so ordinary that its very harmlessness would later become part of the horror. The "I can't believe it's yogurt" store on Anderson Lane was the kind of business people entered without thinking twice. It was brightly lit, casual, cheerful by design. A place made for sugar and routine, for small indulgences and part-time work. At that hour, though, the evening was narrowing. The day's bustle had thinned. The girls inside were approaching the end of their shift, the point in the night when labor changes flavor. Closing time has its own mood. There's less performance in it. Fewer smiles held in place for customers, fewer little public gestures. The body begins to lean toward home even while the hands are still busy. Counters are wiped. Registers are counted. Chairs are checked. Doors are watched. The clock starts to feel louder than it really is. For teenagers, especially, the final stretch of a work shift can feel like a strange in-between space. Not fully public and not yet private. Not entirely adult, but no longer childlike either. The girls in the shop that night were standing exactly in that in-between. They were young enough that home still waited for them as a certainty, old enough that responsibility had placed them in charge of a business after dark. They were not in some hidden place. They were in public. Behind glass, beneath fluorescent light. And still, somehow, that would not save them. It is one of the grimest truths in violent crime that the beginning rarely looks like a beginning. It looks like an interruption, a customer at the wrong hour. A face not recognized, a movement that feels only slightly off. The world does not ring an alarm bell when ordinary space is about to turn predatory. It merely shifts very slightly at first, and only later do those small shifts become unbearable in memory. In the case of the yogurt shop murders, the exact sequence of the incident would become clouded by damage, disputed interpretations, and the years of confusion that followed. But the broad shape is clear enough to chill the blood even now. At some point that night, one or more perpetrators entered the store while the girls were still inside. Whether they came with a formed plan, whether they expected robbery alone, whether violence escalated from impulse to atrocity, whether there were moments when escape almost seemed possible, all of this would later become tangled in the unresolved history of the case. But what is beyond dispute is that the girls were overtaken. Control passed from them to whoever came through that door. That transfer of control is the true beginning of the incident. It is the moment ordinary time ends. Before that, there is the soft machinery of a routine Friday evening. After that, there is fear. Fear has a terrible intelligence. It changes the body fast. It sharpens hearing. It turns the smallest sounds into warnings. A voice at the wrong volume can feel like a blow before any hand is raised. A command can rearrange the nervous system in a second. Inside that yogurt shop, under those lights, the girls would have understood at some point that something was deeply wrong, and once that understanding settled in, the room they had known as a workplace would have become unrecognizable. Every object changes under threat. The counter is no longer a counter but a barrier, insufficient and fragile. The back room is no longer storage but a possible trap. The front windows are no longer a sign of safety but panes that somehow do not let rescue in. The register is no longer money to be counted but a focus of demand, a point around which danger organizes itself. There are moments in crimes like this where one can almost feel the collapse of adolescence itself. Girls who only hours earlier were moving through the small social weather of youth are suddenly forced into the oldest and ugliest human reality. Power exerted through terror. The incident did not simply happen to them physically. It happened to their sense of the world. A part-time job became a place of captivity. An ordinary evening became a last landscape. The storefront became a sealed chamber of dread. The mind recoils from imagining too much, and it should. There is a line between honest description and exploitation, and this story demands that line be respected. But respect does not mean softening the truth until it loses shape. These girls were subjected to a crime of extraordinary brutality. They were not killed quickly in some detached act of violence. They were trapped inside an escalating sequence of domination, fear, and physical harm. The perpetrators had time. That is one of the ugliest facts that hangs over the incident. Time to control the space. Time to move through it. Time to deepen the crime. Time to decide. More than once, not to stop. In many murders, there is a single fatal burst, an eruption of rage or panic or calculation. Here, the violence appears to have unfolded in stages. And staged violence carries with it a special moral horror. It means the perpetrators inhabited the suffering they were creating. They stayed with it. They made choices inside it. They crossed one boundary and then another, until what remained was not merely robbery or assault, but annihilation. The girls were eventually bound. That detail alone reshapes the room in the imagination. Binding is intimate in the worst possible way. It is not the wild strike of someone out of control. It is control itself made physical. To bind a victim is to reduce them from person to object. To deny movement, to deny agency. To announce with terrible clarity that the perpetrator intends to decide what happens next. One of the reasons this case has remained so emotionally unbearable is that so much of it suggests not only violence but deliberate helplessness imposed on the victims. The perpetrators did not simply come, kill, and flee. They created conditions of fear. They trapped the girls in those conditions. The store that night must have felt as though it were shrinking around them. Fluorescent light has a way of becoming harsher in moments of distress. It flattens color, sharpens surfaces, and makes everything appear more exposed. One imagines the hum of the machines continuing, obscene in their indifference. One imagines the cold sweetness of the shop's ordinary smell, turning sour in the throat under panic. One imagines the front windows reflecting the inside back at itself. The parking lot beyond too dark and too far away. The public world existing only feet from the scene, yet inaccessible. Useless. There is a particular cruelty in crimes committed in spaces built for cleanliness and casual pleasure. The contrast becomes part of the violence. A yogurt shop is a place of harmless appetite. Of plastic spoons, paper cups, sticky countertops, teenage chatter. To transform such a place into a site of torture and death is to create a moral dissonance that lingers far beyond the event. It stains memory. It means that anyone who later recalled that chain of stores, that smell, That kind of brightly lit interior could never again do so without some shadow passing through the image. And then there is the fire. The fire is one of the most revealing and haunting parts of the incident because it comes after so much has already been done. Setting the shop ablaze was not an accident, not collateral damage, not some random flourish at the margins of the crime. It was an act with purpose. It was meant to destroy evidence, to erase, to blur, to turn the room itself into something unreadable. Fire in the aftermath of a violent crime often feels like the perpetrator's final argument with reality. It says, "What I did must not remain visible." It says, "Let heat and smoke ruin the story before anyone else can piece it together." It says, "If bodies and objects and surfaces speak, burn their language away." But fire is also a confession of fear. Calm. Untouchable killers do not need to set rooms on fire. Panic does. Desperation does. A person who believes the scene itself may betray him reaches for destruction as a form of silence. That the perpetrators in this case chose arson suggests both calculation and anxiety. They knew enough to fear what the store contained after they left it. They understood, at some level, that what had happened inside those walls was not just murder, but a sequence of acts that might leave marks more eloquent than any witness. So they tried to erase the room. The horror of the incident, then, is not one moment but an arc. The entry, the taking of control, the escalation, the binding, the assaults, the murders, the decision to ignite the building. Each step strips away another layer of human restraint. Each step reveals a deeper willingness to continue. By the time the perpetrators left, the crime had moved beyond anything that could be explained away as opportunistic violence. It had become something colder and more depraved, an event that would force everyone who later examined it to confront the possibility that the people responsible were capable not merely of criminality, but of sustained moral emptiness. And yet what makes the yogurt shop murders especially tormenting is that the incident did not end in an emotional sense. When the perpetrators walked out, it continued in the fire itself. In the delay between crime and discovery, in the night outside, carrying on as if nothing had happened while inside that shop, the evidence of brutality burned. Think of how many moments in a city unfold unconnected to catastrophe. Cars pass. People unlock front doors. Someone laughs at a neighboring business. Someone else complains about the cold. The ordinary world remains insultingly intact, while a hidden room becomes the center of unimaginable suffering. This contrast is part of the psychic violence of such crimes. It reminds us that the worst things can happen not in dramatic isolation, but under the skin of ordinary time. Somewhere during or after the fire, emergency services were finally drawn in. Flames announce themselves more honestly than crime. Smoke escapes. Light changes. Something becomes visible from the outside. But by then, of course, the essential damage was done. The shop had already been turned into a tomb and then into an attempted erasure. The girls who should have gone home were gone into another category entirely, one that no parent ever imagines for a child until the world forces it upon them. The bodies would later tell investigators what they could, and the room, despite the attempt to destroy it, would still retain enough to build theories. Enough to haunt, enough to raise questions that never fully settled. But in the incident itself, before official language stepped in, before photographs and reports and legal argument, there was only this: 4 girls trapped in a place of supposed safety, confronted by perpetrators who did not stop at theft, did not stop at domination, did not stop even after killing, but tried to burn the evidence of their own choices into ruin. The emotional architecture of that incident matters because it shaped everything that came later. If the crime had been simpler, quicker, narrower, perhaps the city would have grieved differently. But this was a crime of layers, and layered crimes tend to produce layered obsessions. People do not only ask who did it, they ask how anyone could have done all this. They ask what kind of minds move through such a sequence without interruption from conscience. They ask whether the perpetrators knew one another well. Whether cruelty fed on itself between them, whether one led and another followed. Whether the girls were targeted or merely encountered, whether there were moments of hesitation, whether anyone outside heard or saw enough to matter and failed to understand it in time. The incident creates those questions because it is so difficult to fit within ordinary models of motive. Even robbery, ugly as it is, does not naturally expand into this. Something else lived in the room by the end of it. Something more malignant than simple theft. That is part of why the case became more than a murder investigation. It became a civic wound, a riddle saturated not merely with mystery, but with revulsion. There is also a painful human impulse, whenever such an incident is reconstructed, to search for a point where fate might have bent another way, a customer who could have arrived later or sooner, a neighboring observer who might have noticed something unusual, a locked door checked one final time, a parent who might have come by, a passing patrol. The imagination does this almost automatically because the alternative is harder to bear if nothing could have interrupted the incident once it began. Then the girls were swallowed by a sequence as absolute as it was cruel, yet history rarely grants us a clean hinge. More often there are only fragments, not enough to save. Not enough to explain, only enough to deepen the ache. In the yogurt shop case, the incident would later become the ground on which every theory had to stand or fail. Suspects would be measured against it, confessions would be tested against its details. Investigators would return to its sequence again and again, trying to determine whether statements matched the physical evidence, whether memory aligned with damage, whether anyone describing the crime truly knew what had happened or only knew what the public already knew. That is the afterlife of an incident like this. It stops being only a crime and becomes a standard of truth. But that came later, in the moment itself. There was no theory, no courtroom, no public language. There were only 4 girls inside a bright little store at the edge of closing time. And then there was fear, and then there was terror. And then there was the kind of violence that changes not only a room, but the moral weather of an entire city. Austin would never again be able to remember that night as just another Friday in December. Too much had happened inside one modest commercial space. Too much had been taken. The incident left behind more than death. It left behind a scene so terrible that people would spend decades circling it, trying to understand whether truth had already been visible in its ruined details or whether the fire, the panic, and the failures that followed had allowed the truth to slip away almost as soon as the flames began to rise. And that is the lasting shape of part 4 of this story. Not simply that the crime occurred, but that it unfolded as a controlled descent from ordinary life into sustained horror, culminating in fire, in silence, and in a city waking the next morning to the knowledge that somewhere between fluorescent light and midnight, 4 teenage girls had been carried beyond rescue by hands that were never supposed to have reached them at all. By the time the fire was discovered and the first responders made their way toward the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop on Anderson Lane, the crime scene had already been transformed twice. First by violence, then by flame. That double transformation is one of the reasons the yogurt shop murders entered Austin's memory not only as a savage crime, but as a riddle wounded at birth. A murder scene can be read, however imperfectly, by those trained to look at blood, objects, positions, entry points, broken routines. But a fire scene is a more treacherous text. Heat changes matter. Smoke obscures sequence. Water from firefighting efforts scatters and dilutes. Fragile evidence weakens or disappears. Rooms collapse inward on their own meaning. When investigators later stepped into that ruined shop, they were not entering a clean narrative. They were entering the wreckage of an attempt to erase one, and yet crime scenes have a brutal stubbornness. Even after fire, even after water, even after panic and destruction, they speak. Not clearly, not kindly, but enough to torment the people who study them, enough to leave behind clues, enough to suggest what had happened there and, just as importantly, what had happened in what order. The first sight of the building alone must have announced that this was not going to be a straightforward emergency. Fire after hours in a small business is one thing. Fire after hours in a business where 4 teenage girls were supposed to be alive is another. The store was not simply burning. It was late, occupied in theory only by young employees and visitors. Wrapped in that strange commercial darkness where every lit flame looks more unreal than it should, there is something about a storefront fire at night that feels exposed and concealed at the same time. The glass fronts and visible signage suggest openness, but once smoke clouds the interior, everything behind the windows becomes unreadable. Firefighters approaching such a scene are trained to think first in practical terms. Access, suppression, hazards, rescue if possible. But there are moments in emergency response when instinct outruns language. A sense that something is very wrong arrives before the facts do. Inside that yogurt shop, the facts would reveal themselves with the kind of force that permanently alters everyone who encounters them. Once the flames were brought under enough control for entry and examination, the interior yielded horror. The bodies of the 4 girls were found inside. It is one thing to be told such a fact in a sentence years later. It is another to imagine the actual moment of discovery, the first human beings forced to understand what they were seeing amid smoke damage, heat, debris, and the sickening confusion left behind by a deliberate attempt at destruction. Firefighters and officers are trained to encounter death. But some scenes rupture training. 4 young victims in a frozen yogurt shop. Bodies inside a burned commercial space. Signs of violence far exceeding accidental death or simple robbery gone bad. This was the kind of discovery that would have turned a procedure into grim disbelief almost instantly. The room itself would have looked wrong in layers, not just burned, but violated, not just damaged, but rearranged by human cruelty. This is where the crime scene begins to separate itself from the abstraction of the incident and become something tactile, visual, almost oppressive in its material reality. Investigators were not looking at a mystery in the abstract. They were looking at surfaces, positions, objects, and remains that had all been altered by terror. One of the first and most haunting truths that emerged from the scene was that the girls had been bound. Even in a damaged crime scene, binding tells a story with extraordinary force. It tells of control, of time, of human contact used as domination. Binding means the victims were not merely overtaken in a burst of violence. It means there was a stage in which the perpetrators imposed helplessness deliberately, at a scene already saturated with brutality. That detail becomes one of the defining clues because it shapes the psychology of the crime. It suggests the perpetrators wanted command over the victims, wanted compliance or submission, wanted the room itself to remain under their direction long enough for the crime to unfold in multiple stages. It indicates that the violence was not instantaneous chaos. It had sequence. It had decisions in it. It had moments where stopping was possible and repeatedly refused. There were also indications of sexual assault, another layer of horror that deepened the depravity of the scene and complicated the evidentiary challenge. Sexual violence in a murder case often carries its own forensic promise, biological evidence, traces, signs of contact, and in this case, that promise would matter enormously, but the promise existed inside a burned environment. Fire had attempted to consume what the perpetrators feared might identify them, and that meant every surviving trace became precious, contested, and vulnerable from the start. Investigators would have known immediately that they were working under conditions of partial ruin. The scene might still contain fingerprints, fibers, blood patterns, accelerant indicators, footwear impressions, or biological material, but everything had to be interpreted through the damage caused by heat and firefighting response. Even the simplest question, where exactly did one action happen relative to another, would have been made harder by destruction. That is why the initial crime scene phase in this case carried such enormous weight. The first hours after discovery are when a scene is most alive with possibility. Every observation matters. Every preserved sample matters. Every assumption matters too. Because once the mind locks too quickly onto a theory, evidence can start being read through expectation rather than caution. At the yogurt shop, the scene did not offer the comfort of a single, easy narrative. It offered a jumble of violence, fire, and silence. The fire itself was a clue. Of course, and not only because it destroyed. Arson almost always asks a question. Why did the perpetrator think burning the scene was necessary? In some cases, the answer is impulsive panic. In others, it is cold awareness of evidence. Here, the fire suggested both calculation and fear. It implied that after the murders, someone remained lucid enough to decide that what had happened inside the shop could not be left untouched. The perpetrators understood that the scene would speak if allowed to remain intact, so they tried to make it incoherent. That decision becomes one of the initial clues, not because it solves the case, but because it reveals a certain kind of offender behavior. Whoever committed these murders was not operating in a total frenzy from beginning to end. There was enough post-crime cognition to attempt concealment. That is a different psychological profile than pure explosion. It means there was, at minimum, a grim practical intelligence moving through the aftermath. Investigators also had to contend with the store itself as a space. Commercial interiors create their own forensic logic. There are points of entry, points of sale, employee areas, customer areas, storage spaces, visible and less visible zones. In reconstructing the crime, detectives would have needed to determine where the girls were first controlled, where they were moved, where money may have been taken, where assaults occurred, where the fire began, and whether the fire's origin point or spread pattern revealed anything about the perpetrator's path through the room. Was the blaze set in a way that suggested haste, or in a way that suggested an attempt to maximize destruction of particular evidence? Was there more than one ignition point? Was an accelerant used? Fire investigators and homicide detectives would have had to work together closely, because the patterns of burn and the patterns of violence were inseparable. The room had to be read as both a murder scene and an arson scene. And those two forms of reading do not always align neatly. One asks what happened to bodies and objects. The other asks what happened to the room as a chemical and physical environment under flame. Together they produce a difficult, often incomplete picture. Then there were the signs of robbery. Cash had apparently been taken from the store. And that fact immediately opened one obvious possible motive. Robbery is common enough to feel almost administratively recognizable to police. A commercial business, late at night, young employees. Cash on hand, these are the ingredients of a crime category investigators know well, but the scene at the yogurt shop quickly resisted being contained by that category. Even if robbery was part of what happened, it did not explain the scale of the violence. The taking of money may have been motive, or may have been convenience, or may have been part of an initial plan that metastasized into something far more sadistic. This is one of the reasons the initial clues in the case pulled the investigation in multiple directions at once. A simple robbery scenario fits some facts but not others. A sexually driven crime fits some facts but not others. A group offense seemed plausible given the control of multiple victims, but the exact number of perpetrators was not immediately certain. Every clue carried possibilities, but few carried certainty. Witness information from around the shopping center and the broader area added to that unstable early picture in the first days after a notorious crime. Witness accounts begin to accumulate in a strange blend of urgency and unreliability. People remember unfamiliar men, unusual cars, odd behavior, fragments of timing. Some of it is useful. Some of it is noise. Some of it feels precise but shifts under scrutiny. In the yogurt shop case, the setting ensured that there were likely people who had been near the store before the fire. Perhaps without realizing they were in the orbit of a developing atrocity. Customers, neighboring employees, passing drivers, residents in the surrounding area all could potentially contribute pieces, but in a crime scene so badly damaged and emotionally charged, witness statements were both essential and dangerous. Essential because the room alone could not answer every question after the fire. Dangerous because public horror can make memory contagious. Once a case seizes a city, People start trying to fit what they saw into what they fear happened. A man loitering becomes sinister in retrospect. A car parked too long becomes suspicious. A sound heard vaguely becomes important after the fact. Investigators had to gather these impressions without letting them distort the physical evidence. Among the earliest and most load-bearing clues in any homicide investigation are the victim positions and conditions at discovery. Even without detailing the scene in exploitative terms, it is fair to say that the arrangement and state of the victims would have spoken volumes to experienced investigators. Were they found together or apart? Had they been moved? Did the condition of the remains suggest that the fire was set before death, after death, or amid a sequence of injuries? These questions are not academic. They define the nature of the crime. They also shape investigative strategy. A scene indicating one offender acting in haste would send detectives one way. A scene suggesting multiple offenders managing several victims would send them another. The yogurt shop murders, from early on, seem to imply complexity rather than simplicity. 4 victims. Evidence of binding, sexual assault, theft, and arson. This was not a clean, narrow crime. It was layered. And every layer multiplied the number of necessary questions. The forensic landscape of 1991 also matters here. DNA analysis existed, but it was far less mature and less routinely decisive than it would later become in public imagination. Biological evidence could be collected and tested, but turnaround, interpretive certainty, and comparative databases were not what they would someday be. That meant the initial clues gathered at the yogurt shop had enormous long-term importance. If samples were preserved well, they might matter decades later. If they were mishandled or contaminated, the consequences could echo through the case forever. In this sense, the crime scene was not only a record of the murders, it was the future of the investigation in material form. Every swab, photograph, note, and preserved item would later become part of arguments over truth. The fact that this case eventually became known for disputed confessions and failed prosecutions makes the early forensic stage even more haunting, because one cannot help wondering where the strongest truth resided. Was it there in the first hours, half hidden under ash and smoke? Was it collected well enough? Was it understood correctly? Or did the fire succeed, at least partially, in creating a permanent fog? Another aspect of the initial clue landscape was behavioral. Crime scenes often reflect offender characteristics in ways that are frustratingly suggestive rather than conclusively identifying. The yogurt shop scene suggested offenders capable of controlling multiple victims, using violence across an extended sequence, and then attempting post-crime destruction. That combination can imply group offending, or at least an offender comfortable enough in dominance to manage a highly risky situation. It can imply youth, recklessness, and bravado, but it can also imply criminal experience or at least familiarity with violence. The challenge is that these psychological readings are often broad enough to be true of many suspects and precise enough to seduce investigators into overconfidence. In notorious cases, detectives may feel pressure to transform scene behavior into a suspect type as quickly as possible. But offender profiles are not answers. They are shadows cast by action, and in this case, the shadow was large and shifting. The community response to the crime scene also became part of the atmosphere around the initial clues. Once word spread that 4 girls had been murdered inside the shop, Austin did what communities always do after an atrocity that violates ordinary safety. It looked for meaning immediately, meaning in rumor, in police activity, in any whispered detail that seemed to make the horror less random. This public hunger can affect an investigation subtly but powerfully. Tips pour in. Expectations rise. Officials feel watched. The crime scene becomes not only evidence but symbol. Every clue carries civic weight far beyond its technical value. That can be useful because public attention often brings witnesses and information. But it can also create dangerous momentum, especially when the evidence itself is messy. The yogurt shop murders did not offer a stable emotional environment for careful patients. They demanded answers from the beginning. The scene, meanwhile, kept offering fragments instead. By the time the first full wave of crime scene processing was complete, investigators had several core realities. 4 teenage girls dead. Evidence of restraint. Evidence of sexual assault. Money missing from the store, and a deliberately set fire intended at least in part to destroy evidence. Those are not minor clues. They are major structural facts. But structural facts are not identity. They tell you the nature of the crime, not who committed it. The hardest transition in any homicide investigation is often the move from what happened to who did it. In the yogurt shop case, that transition would prove treacherous. The crime scene said enough to horrify, enough to suggest, enough to create theories, but not enough to deliver a name with clean certainty. And because it did not, every later development in the case would be haunted by the original room. Suspects would be measured against it. Confessions would be compared to it. Prosecutors would try to align story with surviving evidence. Defense attorneys would point to inconsistencies, to contamination, to the room's stubborn resistance to neat narrative. The initial clues did not simply launch the investigation. They became its permanent conscience. They remained there in the background, asking whether each new claim truly fit what the shop had revealed in those first ruined hours. That is what makes this crime scene so haunting in retrospect. It was both rich and broken, eloquent and damaged, full of clues and still somehow withholding. It contained the truth in pieces, but perhaps not in enough pieces to prevent later distortion. The fire had not silenced the room entirely, but it had roughened its voice. The shop could say 4 girls were trapped here, controlled here, brutalized here, killed here, and then nearly erased here. It could say robbery alone was not enough to explain the cruelty. It could say whoever did this feared the evidence they were leaving behind, but it could not say their names. Not clearly enough, not in a way the system could hold without wobbling. And so the crime scene became the first great tragedy after the murders themselves, a room that still spoke. But through smoke, through ruin, through clues that pointed outward into one of the most notorious unresolved nightmares in Texas history, where the dead had told investigators almost everything except the one thing everyone needed most. In the years after the yogurt shop murders, the investigation did what many high-pressure murder investigations do when fear, politics, grief, and public demand began pulling at it from every side. It widened, lurched, fixated, doubled back, and slowly began mistaking momentum for clarity. Austin did not experience these killings as just another terrible crime. The city experienced them as an assault on its own sense of order. And that meant the investigators working the case were never simply collecting evidence in quiet. They were doing it under the gaze of a traumatized public that wanted names, arrests, and the emotional relief of a villain dragged into the light. But the dead do not always leave behind a straight road to the living who harmed them. Sometimes they leave a landscape full of partial tracks, damaged clues, contradictions, and silence. That was the problem at the heart of the yogurt shop case from the beginning. The crime scene had revealed a great deal about the brutality of the offense, but it hadn't yielded a clean answer to the most important question: who had done it? The investigation moved through that uncertainty like a person feeling along a wall in a smoke-filled room. And as time passed, the pressure to find the right suspect began to blur with the pressure to find any suspect who could be made to hold the story. The murders remained unsolved for years, and that unsolved status carried its own violence. Detectives kept working leads, names surfaced, faded, returned. Tips came in from people who thought they had seen someone, heard something, remembered a man with the wrong kind of stare or a car parked where it should not have been in any notorious case. The longer the mystery survives, the more the city starts manufacturing its own shadow cast of possible offenders. Men with criminal records, men with violent histories, men who knew the area, men who made someone uneasy in retrospect. Each possibility arrives wrapped in hope, and hope in a murder case can be dangerous because it makes people eager to believe that the final door is opening, even when they are only walking into another room of confusion. Eventually, the investigation settled its weight on 4 young men: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Welborn. All 4 would, in different ways, become entangled in the case's most tragic investigative dead end. A dead end made not only of thin evidence and disputed confessions, but of institutional certainty, growing where certainty had not actually been earned. Later reporting and court records make clear that these 4 men were accused in connection with the murders, while only Springsteen and Scott were ultimately tried and convicted before those convictions collapsed. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Welborn were charged but never convicted, and all 4 men were formally declared innocent in 2026 after new DNA evidence pointed elsewhere. What happened in between is one of the ugliest examples of how an investigation can become trapped inside its own need to resolve itself. The state's theory hardened over time around the idea that these young men had been involved in the crime. And once that hardening began, everything else started to organize itself around extracting admissions, reconciling inconsistencies, and forcing a terrible, damaged case into a shape that could stand up in court. But a case is not true because it is forceful. It is not true because detectives believe it. It is not true because prosecutors can tell it with conviction. And in the yogurt shop investigation, one of the central tragedies is that belief seems to have outpaced proof. The confessions became the center of gravity. That fact, by itself, should make any careful observer uneasy in a case of this magnitude. Confessions can be powerful evidence, but they are not magic. They are produced inside human situations, and human situations can be coercive, manipulative, contaminated, and false. In the Austin case, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott both made incriminating statements after lengthy interrogations, and both later maintained that those statements were coerced. The Innocence Project and later reporting described the interrogations as aggressive and deeply flawed. In Scott's case, part of the interrogation was videotaped, and that tape reportedly showed a detective holding a loaded gun against Scott's head. There are details that change the emotional temperature of an investigation instantly. And that is one of them. A loaded gun near the head of a suspect during questioning is not the image of careful truth-seeking. It is the image of force, of psychological domination, of a system beginning to act as though the answer matters more than the method by which it is obtained. Once that line is crossed, the reliability of everything produced afterward is poisoned. Yet at the time, in the emotional weather of a city desperate for resolution, those confessions gave the investigation what it had been starving for: a story. Stories are seductive in criminal cases. They turn shards into sequence. They let authorities say this happened, then this, then this. And here are the men who did it. They offer relief not only to the public but to the investigators themselves. Because an unsolved atrocity is exhausting to carry, the confessions seem to answer the case's central need. They placed known men inside the crime. They offered details. They allowed prosecutors to move forward. But the closer one looks, the more the whole thing begins to resemble a structure built on compromised foundations. One of the enduring problems with false confessions is that they often contain a confusing mixture of error and apparent knowledge. Suspects under pressure can guess, absorb details from interrogators, incorporate public information, or shape their answers around cues they do not fully understand they're being given. That makes such statements seem persuasive from a distance and rotten under scrutiny. In the yogurt shop case, that rot would become more visible over time. Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to death. Scott was convicted and sentenced to life. Those outcomes gave the city, for a while, something close to official closure. The state had found its monsters. The machinery of justice had spoken. Families were asked, once again, to place their hope in the idea that at last the right story had been told. But the case did not rest easily. It kept resisting. Appeals exposed constitutional problems. Courts found that Springsteen's confession had been improperly used against Scott, and the convictions unraveled. By 2006 and 2007, Texas appellate courts had overturned both convictions, and both men were awaiting new trials.